All right, it's time to talk about the last three heads of development for our Chreia, which would be the contrast, the comparison, and then lastly, the epilogue. And the contrast and comparison, the format and the flow of the paragraphs themselves are very similar. They're just opposites. In the contrast, we are trying to find an individual, and it could either be from history or literature or current events or the Bible, and we're trying to find someone who did not exemplify this quote, meaning their life shows a contrast to the quote. They are not an example of someone for whom this quote applied or was used in their life. So in order to figure this one out, the best way to go about it is to not so much look at the quote itself, and we're still using poor and content is rich and rich enough by William Shakespeare. But rather than looking at the quote again, this is where the paraphrase that the students have made in their second head of development is going to be the most helpful. So if we look at the meaning of this particular quote and we go back to what we wrote for our paraphrase, it would be that if one has little wealth but is satisfied with all that God's given them, then they are richer than a man that has all the money in the world but is not content or is not happy. So to find a contrast, we need to find someone who did have a lot of money, who had what the world would see as rich and wealthy, but had everything going for them, but yet still was not content. So there are lots of examples, particularly in current events, in the modern world, of people who have spent their life chasing after what the world defines as rich and wealth through money, and yet never really showed satisfaction. So we have to find someone whose dissatisfaction we can prove, someone who seemed to have everything, but that we can show really and prove that they were not happy. So while there are lots of examples of this in current events, I'm going to choose to talk about Howard Hughes. So Howard Hughes was one of the wealthiest individuals, seemed to have everything, but yet if you were to look at his life, you could prove that he never truly gained contentment. So he was an aviator, he was a film director, he founded an aircraft company, he created a seaplane called the H-4 Hercules and the first retractable landing gear. He produced and directed many movies and continued to gain wealth over time. However, he was a recluse, showing that he was never really happy. He still kept to himself, lived within his house, did not go out much, and on top of that, he decided to cure his unhappiness and his loneliness by turning to things of this world that never would truly satisfy. So to medications or to drugs, seeking after things that he thought would make him better, and they didn't. So with that particular example, we can prove lots of things that he did that would be considered successful, but we can also prove that he wasn't satisfied through the choices that he made, through the things that he turned to create happiness, and to the fact that he lived this depressed life as a recluse, showing that he never really found contentment. So he would be one that contrasts the quote, poor and content is rich and rich enough, because he was not poor and he was not content, yet he had all the riches in the world. So he did not understand that maybe had he had none of these things, he would have learned to be content where he was. So sometimes this is a little bit tricky for students. They really need to go back to the original quote and then the paraphrase and read, okay, what does this quote mean? Because they can get lost in the words of the quote and it seems really tricky. So The paraphrase will be the most helpful. And this is also where everything that the students learned in 4th and 5th grade about description is going to help them, because they're basically building and describing a case. They're describing why Howard Hughes would not be one who followed this quote, which means they have to use description. They have to give concrete examples from his life. This paragraph should be roughly 5 to 8 sentences. So they really need to put a lot of thought and effort into defending the individual that they chose. Once that piece is done, they can move on to the next head of development, which is the comparison. And you've probably guessed that the comparison would then be someone who did exemplify this quote. So in this case, someone who showed in their life that they were content, the choices that they made, the way that they lived their life shows happiness, contentment, satisfaction, despite the money that they actually have in their bank account or the money that they actually own. So a good example for this would be someone like George Mueller, who we can defend and describe that he was a preacher, that he earned a decent salary, yet he made a distinctive choice. Instead of laying up treasures on this earth, he chose to lay up treasures in heaven by giving his money away. He gave his money to the poor. And eventually he even stopped preaching and decided to care for the orphans of Bristol, England, completely. And he ran several different orphanages taking care of children. And instead of taking a salary, he relied completely on the donations of others to run the orphanage, to take care of these children, and refused to stop until he received a sign from the Lord, which in his mind would have been if the orphanage ever ran out of food, meaning he would continue to do the Lord's work and he would continue to give to this orphanage so long as there was food provided for the children. And over the course of his life, he earned roughly $7,500,000, but he spent all of it on the needy, leaving him with little. But yet, he proved satisfaction. He proved contentment. He proved that he had the joy of something that was beyond anything that money could buy. He had the joy of the Lord. He had the joy of giving to others, and he was content. So you've got two distinct different examples. One does not exemplify the quote, lived a life that contrasts the point the quote is trying to make. And then another who did live out this quote, did prove the value of these words, that being satisfied with what God's given you is better than all the money in the world. So again, this paragraph for comparison is going to be roughly 5 to 8 sentences. It's still going to use an example from history, from literature, from current events or the Bible, but you've got two differing examples. One goes against the quote, one supports the quote, but both of them are used to defend that these words by William Shakespeare are valuable and should be listened to. So the one warning or heads up I want to give you for these two paragraphs is that because sometimes choosing individuals requires a little bit of research, and we talk about that in class, how to kind of look up, online, how to find somebody that would fit this particular quote or the quote that's given. Sometimes people or students have a hard time with that, and they instead decide to give an example from their own personal life. And there are times when I've let that slide, but the purpose of these two paragraphs are really specifically to use somebody that is well known, someone that is known in history, known in literature, proven time and again over the course of their life to exemplify the quote. That's kind of where we want to gear students. So I understand that there are times when it's really, really applicable to them and they can think of a really good personal life moment to defend the quote, but we really want to be gearing them towards more persuasive speech And that's by looking at someone whose story is known to others, more public, I guess, so to speak. So that's where they will probably need the most help, is just figuring out, okay, how do I research this? How do I find someone who was poor but yet happy, or someone who was rich but yet unhappy? And that takes a little bit of time learning how to do that. So that's where you as the parent are going to come in and kind of help guide them through that process until they understand how they can research an individual that does this. So, and then lastly, we get to the epilogue. And this is, I tell those students, if you've made it to this point, you're doing great. This is an easy paragraph in that you're just summarizing your thesis and summarizing your arguments. So you're proving that you've wrapped all this up, and now you're at the point where you can just kind of restate that if we hear and obey the words of William Shakespeare, we are going to be much more content, much more satisfied than if we had, even if we have little. So the hardest part for this paragraph is simply leaving the reader with something to think about. This goes beyond just summarizing the two examples that you've given through the comparison and the contrast, and this goes beyond just summarizing the thesis. You want the students to end on something that is memorable and something that's going to leave the reader walking away going, huh, that's interesting. I want to think more about that. So in this case, I'm going to choose to use a Bible verse. This principle is also found in Luke 12:33, which states, "Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in heaven that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys." And just by taking that and linking it to the reader and telling the reader that they should consider how they can live out this verse in their own life would be one way to leave a memorable ending. So ending with a question, a thought to ponder, a Bible verse, a quote, anything that could maybe make this whole piece applicable to their own lives. So that is Chreia in a nutshell. Hopefully all of this has been useful, and let me know if there's anything else I can do. Thanks.